Chapter 1 Sticky Notes. As I go through the chapter, go ahead and take a pile of sticky notes and make your book look like mine. These are important videos if you're absent or if you want to get ahead or even as review. Okay, so Chapter 1 starts with an introduction to environmental science. On page 3, make sure you know those terms, biotic, abiotic, and what environmental science means, which is different than environmental studies. Environmental science involves experiments, lab work, inquiry, and using that science to understand global issues and global change. Environmental studies is more of a social studies type of class where you apply the science to environmental laws and politics and human population growth. We'll cover those areas too in this class, but it does this class does involve lab work, which is why it's environmental science. All right, go ahead and turn the page. On page 4, make sure that you know this picture at the top, figure 1.1, which goes from renewable to non-renewable resources. Notice that these two columns are both renewable. The first column, sunlight, wind energy, and wave and geothermal, are all renewable on a daily basis. This next column is also renewable, but it takes a while. For example, agricultural crops have to regrow, so it might be 6 months to a year. Fresh water depends on the water cycle and how much it rains to renew. Forest products, for example, trees. If you cut down a tree, depending on the species, it can take anywhere from 20 to 100 years to grow to maturity again. So it's renewable, but again, it takes a lot of time. Soils renew themselves, but they take about 100 years to grow an inch of topsoil. These resources are non-renewable, which means when they're gone, they're pretty much gone. They will take millions of years to renew, and that is essentially non-renewable in the terms of human perspective. And that is your 3 fossil fuels. Oil, natural gas, and coal are 3 fossil fuels, and then also your minerals, copper, aluminum, iron, other metals. Make sure you know that the agricultural revolution began 10,000 years ago, and that the industrial revolution began in the mid-1700s. Agricultural revolution is when we went from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. The Industrial Revolution was when we started taking fossil fuels, starting with coal and then eventually going to oil, and using those fossil fuels as a form of energy to do work that people or horses used to do, and now they're done by machines. And those are 2 important revolutions to know. On the next page, we have a graph showing human population growth, and you can see it's skyrocketing in the 20th century, or actually since the Industrial Revolution. Agricultural Revolution increased it a little bit, and then it's been slowly increasing. You have a slight dip in the Middle Ages due to the Black Plague, and then skyrocketing with the Industrial Revolution. So make sure you understand this graph that human population growth has skyrocketed since the Industrial Revolution. Know what Malthus said and Ehrlich said, and they are slightly different. So make sure when you read them, they're not exactly the same. Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. Malthus wrote a book or an essay called The Essay on Principle of Population, which is here. That's Malthus, and then Ehrlich's book is down here. And they are slightly different. But Ehrlich's predictions have failed because of agricultural and technological advances. So he thought that with human population growth, we were doomed to starve. There would be too many people for the amount of food that we could grow. And that prediction has failed, thankfully. But a lot of people think we are coming to another point where we may not be able to grow enough food for our population as it goes from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 billion people. All right, turning the page to page 6. We have a picture of Tragedy of the Commons. So Garrett Hardin wrote an essay basically saying that if you have a bunch of people sharing a common resource that's owned by all, each one will think individually and use up that resource, and then that resource is depleted, and then either people starve to death or they have to move away or something like that. So this is a nice cartoon featuring this with rangeland. So we have some examples. Rangeland is the one featured in the essay, but then also fishing in the ocean or even in a lake. If you have too many fishermen out there catching all the fish without limits, pretty soon the oceans will be depleted, and we're facing that actually worldwide in the oceans. In some places like the United States, and especially some places like Alaska, we have very serious limits and quotas to prevent overfishing from happening. Air is a commons, forests for lumber, and forests also provide us with clean air, with water and recreation. And these are public forests, not privately owned forests. And most of the forests in the United States are publicly owned by us, the people. They are called national forests. Our water supply that's shared by everybody, our open spaces, parks, and trails. And so the solution to Tragedy of the Commons is rules, laws, regulations that people have to follow. For example, in the parks, you can't just dump your trash. You can't cut down a tree and use it for your own personal good. You have to have your dog on a leash. You can't, start a bonfire in the middle of a park, and unless it's approved. And all of those regulations make the parks nice for everybody. On the next page, we have the concept of a eco-footprint. And basically, an individual home uses a lot of resources that you cannot see. So understand the caption and understand the picture here. And a lot of times these resources are used before the things you buy get to your house. For example, this pen that I'm using. It's made out of plastic, which is petroleum oil, and some metals here at the tip. But there was a lot of resources used to make this pen. There was a lot of water used to cool the machines. There was a lot of probably coal used to burn the electricity to make this pen in China. And then the amount of oil that was burned in the barges to bring this pen in a ship from China to America. And so a lot of the resources that we see, now this picture shows trees, but it's figurative of resources. So a lot of the resources that we have used, we don't know we've used them, but they're used indirectly in the products that we make. The food that you buy, the water that was used, the land that was used, the pollution from feedlots, from meat that you eat, all of those kinds of things are indirect costs, and they all are a part of an eco-footprint. There have been many civilizations that have collapsed due to overusing their natural resources and not taking care of what they have. There was an author who wrote a book called Collapse. Jared Diamond is his name. And the three most famous civilizations that collapsed due to basically degrading or harming their environment are Easter Island, the Mayans, the Anasazi, and then a few others here. And these are the three main ones. to remember for an exam. Oh, going back here, let me add on here the Dust Bowl. Now, some of you learned that in 11th grade history, and some of you will learn it this year in 11th grade history, but that's kind of a regional thing. It wasn't a whole civilization, but in Oklahoma and the surrounding states, we'll learn about this later, but the settlers there harmed their environment by cutting down all the prairie grass and planting their entire acreage with wheat. And then the droughts came, and they plowed their soil, and then the winds came, and the plowed soil was loose, and it blew it everywhere, which is why you have the dust storm. And so they did not practice soil management. And so that is a small regional example of a civilization that collapsed. Okay, so what evidence do we have of the collapse on Easter Island? You know, when the explorers got there, they just saw these big statues that were left over. And so scientists now have to look at, well, what used to be there? Well, they found pollen remains of big, huge trees. So this island used to be very lush, like Hawaii is lush, and now it's not lush at all. They found wood remains of tree species that are no longer there. They found the bones of animals that are not currently found on the island, and so they knew it was a vastly different ecosystem than it used to be. So what happened in Easter Island? Well, they cut down the trees to build the statues, which caused soil erosion, which meant faster runoff of the soil into, not just the soil, but also drinking water when it rains. The drinking water should soak into the ground, but when the soil's not there to hold it, and the tree roots are not there to hold it, then it doesn't soak into the ground and it runs off into the ocean. And so you've lost fresh drinking water. Instead, if it soaks into the ground, then you can pump it out with a well. No trees mean no canoes, which means less food from the ocean, which both of these things, their competition for food and water, led to war, and they killed each other. Make sure that you know this whole I'm looking for the right word, this whole scenario here, this whole sequence of events, because you may be asked to write about that. What were the sequence of events that led to the collapse of the civilization on Easter Island? And sometimes you're asked to write about that, and you need to know sequencing of events. Okay, on the next page, we have this lady spraying DDT pesticide to get rid of lice on a child's head. Seems crazy to us now. I would never let my children be sprayed with pesticide like that, but they didn't know the harmful effects back then. A lot of things in environmental science are not all black and white. There's lots of shades of gray. Are things all good and all bad? Well, there's a lot of in between. And there's a lot of good and bad to things. For example, in Africa, DDT is a good thing because it kills mosquitoes that carry malaria. But in the United States, DDT is bad because it kills birds inadvertently. What happens is that the DDT kills bugs, but then the DDT runs into rivers, lakes, and then the ocean, where it gets in with the plankton, and then the small fish eat the plankton, then the big fish eat the small fish, and then your top predatory birds like bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and ospreys eat the big fish, and they get DDT in their body, and it builds up for a long time. And then that DDT in the birds' bodies cause their eggshells to be weak, and so the birds sit on the eggs to incubate them, and the eggs crack and die. And so that's why DDT is a problem for birds. And on this page also we come across the concept that the rich have different perspectives than the poor. We can say, yay environment, we'll buy organic, we will do what's right for the environment, but also we have more spending power. The poor don't have a lot of options to do the right thing for the environment. They're just trying to survive.